Now to our first story. The Domestic Violence Act 2007 Act 732 is meant to support and protect victims and survivors of gender-based violence, yet portions of the act remain unimplemented, making victims and survivors more vulnerable. One such portion is the fund established under the Domestic Violence Act, which is meant to support the medical bills of victims and survivors. Activists are calling for more political will towards the growth of the fund and its decentralization to make it more accessible. The following report tells us more about the Gender-Based Violence Fund 8 years on and why it is still not fully operationalized to benefit survivors and victims of gender-based violence. Here's a report by Mavis Ofe-Ichampon.
Enshrined in the Domestic Violence Act 2007, Act 732, Section 29, there must be the establishment of a fund for victims. The fund under Section 29 should be called the Victims of Domestic Violence Support Fund. Monies from the fund shall be applied towards the basic material support of victims of domestic violence, training the families of victims of domestic violence for any matter connected with the rescue, rehabilitation and reintegration of victims of domestic violence, towards the construction of reception shelters for victims of domestic violence in regions and districts, and for training and capacity building of persons connected with the provision of shelter, rehabilitation and reintegration. The sources of money for the fund under Section 31 of the Domestic Violence Act 2007, Act 732, will include voluntary contributions to the fund from individuals, organizations and the private sector, and monies approved by Parliament for payment into the fund. However, since the establishment of the fund, only 10,000 Ghana cedis has been deposited into the account by the state. This, gender activists say, hinders the fight against GBV, as victims need to be supported through this fund.
We have a domestic violence fund, which after it was established, only 10,000 Ghana cedis have since been deposited in that account by the state. And the bureaucracy that one has to go through to access that fund on its own is very challenging. So imagine the whole of this country, in every region, every district. How do people even access that fund from Accra here? Like the processes you go through from the local grassroots level all the way up to the national level is a challenge. We lack shelters. Not all the regions of Ghana have shelters that are established there. Most of it, we have nationally about 3 shelters. And out of that 3, for government, 2 is in Accra. Then there are private organizations like Pearl Safe Haven and Act Foundation that have also established in Accra. ActionAid Ghana got 1 for the government and handed it over to the government of Ghana in the Upper East region as well. So it's a very big challenge.
The government haven't signed and ratified all these international instruments, and also even passing laws in this country about domestic violence prevention. They should put money into resourcing a domestic violence fund. So what is the point of having this fund and the money is not adequate enough to even support the intended victims?
According to UNICEF, the fund needs an allocation of at least 1 million Ghana cedis to operate shelters for victims of sexual and gender-based violence, without counting the cost of providing other support services envisioned in the law. However, in 2021, only 1.5 million was released for the fund out of the 2.6 million budget allocation. The funding shortfall interferes with the provision of support services such as basic material support for victims, counseling families, supporting shelters, compensating witnesses, rehabilitation and reintegration of victims into communities, and training of personnel who support victims of GBV.
The onus lies on the state to lay the foundation in terms of protecting its citizenry. And citizenry not exempting victims of violence and harassment or any form of gender-based violence. Also advocacy, engaging government and other stakeholders to, as it were, strengthen the existing systems and structures so that we can better protect victims and survivors if they need any sort of support as well from the state too.
The Victim Support Fund should be available across the country, yet it is situated in Accra, making it difficult for victims in other parts of the country to have access to the fund. One of the purposes of the fund is to be applied towards the basic material support of victims of domestic violence, but this is not the case. A budget brief by UNICEF showed that on average, survivors need at least 900 Ghana cedis to access services such as medical examination and treatment and the police medical report form needed for court cases, as well as the transport cost to the court. In some cases, survivors need up to 5,000 Ghana cedis if an age assessment, DNA test, counseling and safe shelter services are needed.
Because you said when I'm defiled or raped, I should be in the health facility in the next 2 hours and get post-exposure prophylaxis so that if the person has something, I don't pick it. I should go in and be screened for hepatitis. I should get a pregnancy test. All these things involves money. So if that person goes and is being tossed, the first 2 hours will be scrapped. Then the 12 hours, 72 hours, he will be going forth and back because he's not getting the money. At the end of the day, if that person is carrying any infectious disease, but if they go and they tell them, come and pay 500, and you said you don't have, then your case will not be handled because that doctor will sign. Because the money should be paid first. Government should see to that money, that they scrap it off, or they should add it to the health insurance.
And when it comes to the medical fees, that is one of the biggest issues that we face, because if someone is defiled or someone is raped and they go to make a report, the police expects them to come with a medical report, and which can only be secured at the hospital. Now, when you go to the hospital to release that to you after the checks and everything, you are required to pay an amount which is not less than 300 Ghana cedis. No, and if the person is someone who does not have enough money, how do you expect someone to be able to raise that much of a money? So most cases, crowdfunding is done to get people to pay that 300 Ghana cedis. And I think several engagements that have gone on with the Medical Association and are still going on.
A survivor who, for the purpose of this report, will be called Awo, struggled to get 300 Ghana cedis to take her daughter, who had been abused by her husband, to the hospital. Awo said that the attitudes and responses from some law enforcement agencies, coupled with the struggles in getting the medical forms and examination, left much to be desired. He said victims are forced to pay between 300 and 1,000 Ghana cedis for consultation, medical examination and treatment to complete police medical forms. This is in spite of provisions in the Domestic Violence Act 2007, Act 732, Section 8, Clause 3, which provides victims free medical treatment in state health institutions. Gender activists say this attitude deters most abusers from reporting cases on time and results in many perpetrators going unpunished because of insufficient evidence to support the prosecution of cases.
The medical people always say that they are witnesses to the case and nobody pays them for going to the court or anything of the sort. That is why they charge those fees as well, which is also a very big challenge. And then in terms of prosecution, it's also tough when people end up going to the police station to report cases, and there is this go and come, and the frustration that is related to it. It makes it also very difficult for people to deal with those instances as well. There is also the challenge of the toxic gender narratives that are also around sometimes that have an effect on how people who are supposed to provide certain services behave with victims and survivors. Imagine someone going to the police station to report a case and the police telling the person that you talk too much. Why won't your husband beat you? when you go home, when you go and he beats you again, then come back to report. So when you have comments like that, it throws people off. Like you keep pushing people to go and still suffer it, as it were. So these and many others are issues that we need to, as it were, deal with it head on, so that we are better able to put systems and structures in place to protect victims and survivors.
In the absence of the fund, most civil society organizations, advocates, gender-based violence activists and NGOs step in to support.
All the survivor wants to know is there's somebody there for me. But imagine if the NGO hasn't gotten enough to pay for that. So that person will not even go to the police station to pick the form or go to hospital. They will boil hot water for the person to sit in, especially the children. So when they see that you are doing that, then they get relieved. In advocating that money should be scrapped. Because somebody who has been raped, where is he getting the 500 from if an NGO doesn't step in? But it is an approved money to be taken in the hospital. So you pay, they give you a receipt. And so we pay and pick the receipt for our report. But even to carry the perpetrators to court, we pay, we transport to the police to carry them.
We have supported victims with medical support because victims have to pay when they go to the hospital to seek any form of support, since the National Health Insurance does not cover for that. Other instances, you support temporarily with accommodation where possible, so that people can flee from whatever harm or abuse they are exposed to if they happen to be living under the care of the perpetrator.
Stakeholders are therefore calling for the decentralization of the fund, enough political will from the government in allocating monies to the fund, and stronger commitment in ensuring that all sections in the Domestic Violence Act 2007, Act 732 fully work.
In a state that does not take adequate care of its citizens, especially in terms of their vulnerabilities with relation to GBV, is actually risking, having to put more resources into social protection work. Well, so we need to protect every citizen, and especially women and girls who are the most at risk in these situations. Government needs to set up more shelters across board for all the regions, now 16, and also put more funds in the domestic violence fund as well.
I think there's still about 20,000 or so that is still in the fund that nobody is able to access because the funds are in Accra. If something happens to somebody way up in the north or deep down in the, in some rural community across the country, how do they get access? Because you recognize the Ministry of Gender is only at the regional capitals that they have. So then how does one access those funds? So those are some of the challenges. And that's why we say that without that kind of political will, we will not see an end to the problem that we are facing as far as violence against women and girls are concerned.
UNICEF's January 2021 Budget Brief Report on Funding Services for Children and Women Survivors of Sexual and Gender-Based Violence (GBV), based on an analysis of over 100 sexual violence cases against girls, boys and women between September and December 2020 in Accra and Kumasi metropolitan areas, UNICEF and its partners were able to estimate that the average cost paid by a child or woman victim of sexual and gender-based violence is at least 900 Ghana cedis. The report recommends the allocation and release of at least 1 million Ghana cedis into the Domestic Violence Fund per year and makes it accessible to operate government shelters for children and women survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. Until these recommendations and calls are adhered to or implemented by the government of Ghana, success in having a Domestic Violence Act with its subsections that seek to support survivors and victims of GBV will prove futile. Mavis of Echampo, GBC News, Accra.